Well, good morning and welcome to our briefing on accountability. I'm Joe Thompson and with Differentiating Strategies, and Differentiating Strategies helps executives develop their strategy and the culture that they need in their leadership team in order to make that work. Vicki?
I'm Vicki Updike with New Sage Strategies, and Joe and I work together with executive team development. New Sage Strategies is a women's leadership development company, equipping women with a toolbox to build their career. And we do that through executive coaching, through women's executive resource groups, and the Women's Leadership Academy, an online leadership course. And I'm thrilled to be here with Joe.
We're going to be focusing on accountability and top leadership, but as we go through this, I think you'll see that the principles that we're talking about apply more broadly than that. Vicki is going to be monitoring the comments as we go along, and we'd like to try to get as much interaction as we can, given the virtual nature of our interaction today. Our goal for today is that each of you come away with something, 1 to 3 things that you take back and can apply that'll help you be a better leader, and specifically to help improve a culture of accountability in your organization. Our first question for the comment box would be, what is it that you want to get out of today? If you can put those in the box so Vicki can see those, we want to make sure that as we go through it, if there's some specific things that we are addressing those things, and we'll try to get to those all of those comments as we move through the presentation. And Vicki, if you have any of those, just pop in. I'm going to move on with, okay, when we last met in October, we were talking about changing culture. And today we're going to talk more specifically about a culture of accountability and what that means. A lot of times we talk about accountability, it seems like it's one of those business term words that we use, but it's used in different ways. Accountability is simply keeping the agreements that we make. Sometimes we have situations where people are screaming for accountability after something's happened. And if you don't have an agreement up front of what the expectations are, and then after something happens, you're wondering, well, why didn't you do this, or why didn't it happen that way, or why didn't you say that? That's more of a blaming than it is really an accountability thing. Accountability, when we get together up front and make an agreement, what it does is it makes the goals clear from the beginning. So by the time we get to the end, we will be not only working against goals we've established, we will have continued communication throughout the process. It also makes sure that as we make that agreement, that we're talking about resources. What are the things that the people need in order to be able to get the work done that they're doing? Finally, that agreement on the front end really changes the dialogue when you have a departure. You're able to talk about, can we talk about the agreement that we had, which is different than why didn't you do that, or why did it go this way? And that kind of upfront piece really promotes the communication we've talked about when we say that what we want is communication as a process that results in a shared understanding. By having the conversation up front, it begins that process of shared understanding and allows you to determine how often are we going to touch base, how often are we going to need to make have any kind of discussion throughout this thing. And that's a lot more comfortable than being surprised at the end, both for you and for whoever the team member is that's involved in that.
So if I could just chime in a little bit, as accountability and as how we use it, those agreements up front that clarity of the agreement is particularly important, and to understand what the person is accountable for. And usually this is results or outcomes, and not necessarily tasks, especially at your level. You're not really assigning tasks. So it's the accountability of the outcome. But I think one of the very important components of accountability that we often look past is that the person has to take it, right? So we also have to, make sure it's clear what they're accountable for, but then they have to say yes, right, Joe?
Yes, we want them to say yes to it. We want them to raise their concerns up front. We want you to be able to ask them, can you play back for me what you heard? So that if there's any adjustment to be made, that adjustment is made when there's small adjustments, not when it's grown into something that's bigger and possibly more expensive to deal with.
Yeah, and that comes to just outlining the resources that are available to them. And, when they start seeing roadblocks come in their way, what role do you play in that accountability, or what role do others play in that accountability? So it's really the dialogue of the process up front, instead of the blame after. We've all seen it. The manager or that comes walking in the room. Okay, who's accountable for such and such, and it just sounds like a blame game. And without those agreements up front, accountability in organizations can almost be like a 4-letter word.
Well, and Vicki was talking about roles. As top leaders, you're going to have a different perspective on what roles are versus other people might have in your organization. So as a senior executive, you're really focused more on making sure that the goals are delivered. Your executive team really are looking at your business outcomes, the sales, the margin, the operation piece of it. Your directors, if you have them, are trying to coordinate the deliverables that are being produced. There's managers that are organizing the work and individual contributors that are doing the work. And in your organization, you may not have that many levels. You may have more than that. But even if you yourself are also playing an individual contributor role, which sometimes happens, or you're helping organize work, which again, sometimes happens in smaller companies. When you have your hat on as the executive, it's to be looking at, what are the outcomes that we're trying to get? That's what you're going to be accountable for, to ownership, which might be yourself. So when we look at that leadership is really a behavior that moves us towards goals. And your role sitting at the top of the organization is to help develop other leaders. So we're talking about these principles of accountability. These principles of accountability aren't just things that you would use. Those are things that you would be modeling and teaching and expecting others within your organization to use, because leaders can show up anywhere in the organization. Vicki and I worked with a small company. It was in transition from one generation to another. And the founder was an entrepreneur who'd built up the company. It was very successful. In fact, it branched out into several companies that were working together to deliver their products. And he wanted his heirs to take this over. And that group of heirs had been working in the business since they were young, real young, starting even with hauling stuff around the office and doing things. And now they'd spent a lot of time there, and they're pretty experienced. But part of the problem was the founder had a hard time quitting work. And no one exactly knew what his job was, because he'd given the titles to his heirs, but he kept popping up all over the place, and nobody wanted to ignore him because he was the majority shareholder, and he'd just been the boss for years. So the employees were left in this tough spot. Do they do what they're assigned to do, or do they and ignore him, or do they go ahead and follow what he's doing? this was putting strain on the family ties, and the heirs were feeling like not only were they being second guessed, but that there was this tension building up between the members of the family. And Vicki, you want to take the story from here?
Yeah, so, when we stepped in, there was just a lot of confusion. And actually even confusion because business was creeping into their personal conversations. This was a family-run business. What we had to start back on is to go all the way back and say, who is responsible for what, and what is that specifically? And I think because the outgoing president just assumed that the next succession knew what that meant. And although they were very involved in the day-to-day operations of the business, they didn't necessarily see themselves owning this senior executive role quite yet. So we really had to manage those deliberate conversations to bring that, to bring clarity there. And I think when we started doing that, the clarity we saw is one of the next generation stepped up with the skill sets to own the president's role. And another gentleman really stood up, and he was really great at the operations. And honestly, after these conversations, he didn't want to be in anything bigger of a role than that. So with these intentional conversations on who's accountable for what and what are those deliverables, that clarity started happening. And then the first generation was able to step out of the business with some greater confidence.
And in fact, the first generation, after we got this, had this conversation, and it was clear what the roles were, within 2 weeks had gone to Florida for 8 weeks. And but again, it's about establishing those understanding, shared understanding up front, and getting that agreement. And they'd rolled into this, just each of them assuming that they knew, and each of them assuming something entirely different.
So I want to add, on this, let's go back. Yeah, on this executive perspective, I mean, it's very normal for no matter where you are in the organization that you spend time at these different levels. Even, as a senior executive or as a president of a company, there are times when you are managing or you are performing tasks. That's common. And actually, Joe and I like to say that kind of, when we get busy and we get stressed, we tend to fall down on this perspective, on this chart, just because we want to feel like we're getting something done. Because when you're working at the senior executive level, you can see that the timeline and the impact, it extends, and that could extend for months and years. So that sense of, did I accomplish anything today, really is diminished. So it's okay for you to spend time down in those other areas. The only thing that Joe and I really recommend is that you are consciously doing that, and that there are times when you have to pull yourself up to that higher perspective, and you do that. Now, as we as executives can't spend all day there. It's just honestly, cognitively too hard. I mean, there's times when you just want to sit down and answer emails, right? I mean, those things happen. So, we're getting comments that people spend time in the weeds, and that's okay, just as long as you can take that time and set aside other parts of your calendar to rise back up. Joe, any other comments on that?
Well, I just want to reinforce that you as executives need 2 to 4 hours a week where you can really be looking at things more broadly in terms of, am I working on the right things? Am I working in the right way? And a lot of times when we start with people, they said, I don't have 2 to 4 hours to do that. Where do we even start? And where we start is just finding some of that time to begin to find some of those things that are further down on that deliverable hierarchy, and say, how can I delegate this? And if I can't delegate it, how can I develop somebody that I can delegate this to? So you being able to be in a position where you're looking at, do we have the right agreements in place? Are we working on the right things? Are we communicating along the way? You know, it takes time to step out of it and be looking across the spans of the organization to be able to maintain that perspective.
And I would just add that today's environment is challenging to see beyond a few months or even the year. I mean, you think back to March and April, we could barely see beyond next week and what the environment was entailing. So, you know, that perspective at the senior level and how far you're looking in the horizon also changes. But it's important for you to rise up there and set that perspective for the balance of the company, especially in these times of change.
We talked about accountability being the agreements we make. And one of the key parts of accountability is there needs to be a balance between what are the outcomes I'm looking for and what resources are available to me. And so when we're making those agreements, we need to make sure that we're also extending the authority. And authority is just being able to utilize resources. And those basically come in two forms. Number one is time, and the other one are discrete or tangible resources. Those can be withheld and applied, like money and a budget for procuring things or whatever. And this concept of these agreements don't just apply to ad hoc assignments or objectives. It also applies to principal accountabilities. So when you have somebody join the organization, as you're going through and orienting that person, it's not inappropriate. In fact, it's great if you walk through it and you ask them to play back to you what they understand as being the things that they're going to be accountable for. What do they understand about the authority that they have? And do they agree that they can do that? And, you know, be able to have that conversation front end. That's entry-level person all the way up to your executives that are working with you, to be able to have that dialogue back and forth. For some people, the bigger resource is just time. You know, they may not be procuring a whole lot of stuff, but they just have time. So understanding what that time is, whether that's as simple as a consumer service rep, understanding that they should be doing 2 calls and resolving 2 problems a problem for every 2 minutes, or, you know, whether it's a salesperson who understands, you know, how much time do I have in order to be able to get my numbers. So as you begin to work on delegation of either formally through the structure of the organization or through giving people ad hoc assignments, make sure that you're making clear to them what authority they have, what resources are available, and also being able to have them play that back to you so that you understand that. You understand that they understand that.
Some of the areas of confusion with authority that we've come across, and especially at that, you know, at that senior executive level, is confusion. So it's unclear. And I always recommend that if you're not clear, to ask and don't assume. There are so many times that we make the assumption that, well, I'm the marketing executive, I should know what that means. And that's not necessarily fair to you or to the person giving you the authority. So it's okay for you to go in and say, okay, I got till the end of the month, right? Or I can work with finance and use finance's time to work through this project. You know, those kinds of, and clarify those resources for you to own what you're accountable for. And also I've found that sometimes the leader may not know the answer, right, Joe? I mean, we found where these are some new problems, and the best way to work through the freedom to expand these resources, money, time, people, is to talk to your peers then and say, okay, as a marketing executive, I may be accountable for sales, but I need other things from other departments. So work with your peer group to understand and align on the resources that are available for you. It's easier to do that upfront and ask the questions than to feel like we're stepping on toes.
And I just want to point out, as Vicki was talking about that with accountability, that she was also talking about something that's longitudinal. That is your peers are the people you also want to have those shared agreements with, so that you're not catching each other by surprise. And just the process of doing this it's just, we always find it really interesting, the things people find out, even though they've been working together for years on things, how they find this improves their communication. So that's one of the reasons we want to have that culture of accountability. Is the culture of accountability drives performance, drives better results. And one of the things that is really key about this is that when we're talking about resources and we're talking about outcomes, those things are issues, and we're not talking about people. So when we get to a problem, what we're doing is we're not having a discussion about what the person did wrong. We're having a discussion about what the issue is. And sometimes the behavior of the person is an issue, but we're trying to take this and move this into a place where people don't feel like they're under that personal attack or personal scrutiny, or that it's what their careers and everything else at stake there. We're talking about let's resolve the issues, because in the end we all want to be successful.
Another tip on when you as a leader are giving this authority is to be clear that there may be areas that you don't know about what they're going to need. So there is always a level of uncertainty. Sometimes things are very clear, but when you're working on strategic issues and moving your business forward, there's some gray space. So it's okay for you to be clear that that's where the conversation should come back to you. And as they're working through it, whatever their resources are, whatever their authority and accountability are, that if there are things become unclear, to bring that to your attention, instead of, again, making assumptions like, I'm the director of marketing, I should know this. That's not necessarily, it's the clarity that is the most important in a culture of accountability. And that just comes with great conversation.
Metaphorically, when we talk about this, talk about accountability, we use this box that we call innovation space. And a lot of times we don't say, well, let's think outside the box. And usually everything has a box. For the most part, you want to do things that are legal. You want to do things that are safe. So there's boxes around things. And for the sake for accountability, typically what we see is there's a range in which the outcome is acceptable. There's a range in which the time can be used, and then there's a range in terms of how much resource by way of money or tangible can be applied to something. And so when you are reaching that agreement, be able to think about deliberately, how big do you want that box to be? Because inside the box, what you're essentially saying is, if you fall anywhere inside those parameters, that is an acceptable outcome. That outcome was worth the resources we invested to get it. And if something starts to fall outside of that, that lets the person know that's working on it that there needs to be a timeout, because they're out of bounds. And it spurs a conversation. So if there's somebody that's brand new in their role, maybe they've just been promoted into it, maybe they new hire coming in from outside, you might want to make that box a little bit smaller so that you can see how they perform. And then as you want to develop them and let them grow in their role, you expand the size of the box. But having that conversation with them so they understand that there's here's the latitude I have to work with. A lot of times what we see is people use just one target, and it's got to be X, and I want you to get $60,000 in sales, and they may think, great, well, I'm going to blow that away. I'm going to get 120, and then they come back with their 120, and it turns out that the most you could have handled is 80 because you don't have the capacity to do it. Now, everybody figures out how to handle that somehow, but having that conversation up front at least lets them know that if that is going to be outside those bounds, that they're going to recognize that's not a bounds. I'm going to call a timeout. We're going to talk about that. And timeout doesn't mean stop. Timeout means coming to a shared understanding and possibly resetting what that understanding is so that the agreement stays fresh with the information that we have available right now. So one of the questions that we have is, as you work with your folks, and as you talk about assignments or talk about how work is going, how do you define that space for them? How do you communicate and reach agreement on what the resources are in time, what the resources are in money, and what the range of the outcomes are?
There's a lot of time in companies spent on creating the box, right? You create budgets, you create departments, you redo your budget, you run through your financials at the end of the month. There's a lot of time spent. And I think that that it's important to realize that it's a box and not a point. Because when you spend, it's the 80-20 rule, right? That once you're about 80% there, is that 20% really worth the effort to continue to analyze, run numbers? And, so it's one thing that, I've been in situations where it's like, we need a budget and it's down to like the dollar. And that's outdated before it even gets printed. So it's important to understand kind of where's the value ending in creating these boxes. And so, that's just something to be conscious of.
Yeah. One of the things when we see an accountable culture, one of the things we find is if we have conversations with people, they're very clear on what the expectations are, what the resources are. We see a lot of conversations occurring with people to maintain calibration and have that occur. And the other thing that happens is we listen to those conversations, they stay focused on issues and really keep it about what are the issues, because we can make changes that will impact those issues. We can make adjustments that'll impact the issues. The times where we see people frustrated and not having that kind of accountability culture is where they're talking about a person and what they're doing and the person as a problem. And ironically, many times not directly addressing the person, but trying to do different things, hopefully that the person will respond different. So being able to have that conversation about the issues puts both people on the same side of the table facing the issue, not across the table talking about here's what you did and here's what you should have done. And that kind of thing develops people, which is what the role of leaders is about, is developing other leaders.
So Joe, there's a question just about, when priorities change, right? And there's urgent issues that interrupt our perfect plan. And how do we continue to maintain our agreements when urgent issues interrupt us? And I think Joe, exactly what he was just chatting about is that's an issue. So when conflicts come up for time, because that's usually where it happens, right? Something urgent comes up, is that the agreement is made to change the parameters of the box. So that usually means it's not that this accountability goes away, but maybe you're adjusting the time span. And maybe you can't. So then how do you bring in other resources to help. So those are those intentional conversations, again, when urgent issue comes flying at you, that you kind of say, okay, these are the priorities, this is where we're going, this is, and how do we continue to make progress on the original agreement? So those are those, and it feels like you slow down, right? I mean, because these conversations, it's like, let's get stuff done, let's continue to move forward. But it's those conversations and that alignment that continues actually as the projects progress, make it go faster. Joe, I know, we've experienced this many different times.
And one of the reasons that we talk about this in terms of using these definitions, like accountability being keeping agreements, authority being having the ability to use resources, and having some simple models like this, is because when we're under stress, that's a really hard time to start figuring out how to express yourself, or what do I need to do. And when we're under stress, we tend to be more emotional, we tend to be shorter sighted, and we tend to be very action oriented. But if we've already established that we're going to work by having shared understanding on things, we're going to work by making sure that we adjust our agreements, and here's some of the words we use to talk about that, it allows you to pull yourself back away from the emotion and be thinking about how we really going to solve the issue that we're facing. So that's also training ourselves to be able to step up and not go down into the weeds when we're under stress. And that importance of communication is a process of maintaining a shared understanding is really important, because it's not that we communicated, it's about that we are communicating and making adjustments as we go along the way.
Yeah, what's our next slide, Joe? I forgot.
I remember.
Okay, there we go. But I want to just, so there's, so the issue, the comment or the rule that we like to use is issues over people. It's just kind of one of those, and there's another, outcomes over tasks. So you as leaders, and what are the rules that you follow? But this issues over people, when it does become people, that's when the issue is people feels like blame. And there may be times when, what's so common is someone didn't get something done, right? You were hoping, or you had, that was completely dependent on you getting this completed, and that person didn't get it to you, right? So it's easy to say, well, that's Susie. Susie didn't get it to me, and that's the reason why. But I would rather, instead of saying Susie didn't get it to you, talk about the issue that the whatever that is that she was supposed to get you, that is the issue, that's not getting done. That may not be Susie's issue. So to strip away the why, or the who, and talk about the what is, and that actually lowers the temperature of conversations, because then people don't feel like they're being called on the carpet, and it and that lowers the emotion. Now, and there are times when people are the issue, but that's a separate conversation, and that's after trends are established, and that's something that those are the harder conversations of managing people, and those are important. But when it comes to, as you have a culture of accountability across your organization, it is issues over people.
That has a number of benefits to it. One is when people are more likely to bring you issues, then they will bring you things that they think they should have done, but maybe they messed up. So in a culture of accountability, what we want to do is if there's an error, it only becomes a mistake when we don't learn from it. So unless you have an employee, a team member, who has intentionally tried to sabotage the organization, most of what you have occurring there is errors and nonconformities. what you want to do is use that as a learning opportunity. And that may be that the team member learns and grows. It may be something that is broader across the organization and that everybody can benefit from. But the idea is, because we had this agreement and now things aren't working out, it gives us grounds to be able to have continue that conversation and see what happened, and bring us the problems early so that we can address them early, because we're not going to be pressuring the people. We're going to be putting our efforts against resolving those issues.
And I want to make sure that we understand that there's not one, right? When in these accountabilities that we are handing out across the organization, everybody owns multiple, and everybody's contribution is different based on, what the, its sales, its expenses, its operations, they're interlocking. So we may all own an accountability, but part of our accountability is also dependent on someone else getting something done. That is also that person's accountability. Joe, I mean, and in the comments, this aspect of helping me get my project done, or helping me get what, and that's a polite way, but it's not helping. They are actually accountable for the component of getting these, so it's your job as owning the big accountability, that if someone has tasks under that they know that that's their accountability to own that. And they have many of those, right? We as, if you look at individual contributors, we don't work on one thing every day. So it's, the quote or the comment in the chat is, Susie's working on her outcome and not helping me with mine. And I think what I would say is that it's not helping me with mine. It's that Susie needs to own the accountability of both projects. And that has to be clear in the communication.
So
I rambled.
What we're asking you to consider, especially during this time of pandemic, some of you are working remotely, and that makes it hard sometimes because we're used to being around each other, talking to each other, maybe having these casual conversations that actually serve as times to calibrate, collaborate, and adjust things. But if you're working remote, that isn't possible. Those become more formal things. I find that my wife works in a very collaborative environment, and she has to almost set up a meeting in order to have a casual, just couple-minute conversation to get things done.
Mm-hmm.
If you're not working remotely, everyone is still under stress. This is just a difficult time. It's difficult economically. It's difficult from a public health standpoint. We're worried about our families and other people and our business and all of these things. And so take a little bit of time on the front end to be able to have those conversations. Take a little bit of time throughout the process of working on something to make sure that those agreements are still understood, rather than take a lot of time later trying to fix the problems. One of the things too is make sure that you're talking about, be explicit about what those resources are, what those outcomes are that you expect. And make sure that as you do that and work through that the people are able to play back to you what they heard about this. And if you're concerned because if it's a complex thing, if it's a new thing, if somebody hasn't done it before, then be clear on what the boundaries are too. Let them know that, hey, if you're approaching spending this amount, or if it's taking you more than this amount of time, then let's come back and talk about that. Or I want you to do this, go talk to these folks, and put those boundaries out there so that people understand that. Again, everybody's under stress. The more you can take what seemed like it was obvious before. With everybody under the stress that they're under, try to make that more explicit now, so that you have that established and shared understanding on things.
So what we mean by boundaries, Joe, specifically, in these cases, boundaries are that innovation space, right? So to explicitly talk about the boundaries of that innovation space, which is hard to do when we're together, right? But now we're all sitting in our own little offices, scattered all over the state. So those boundaries, we used to have what we called an open door policy, which people could do the pop in, and we could just check in, you can kind of check their temperature and just see where they're going on this project. Reestablishing that pop in and how you want people to do that with you, or how you do that with others, is important to agree to those, because it's I've heard the comment, it's not that we're working from home, we're living at work. And so that's where we need to keep some of that boundaries in place. We don't have that transition time of the commute anymore. And that is adding to the stress of what we feel our productivity are, and to feel like I got something done today. So those boundaries are in both areas, the specifics of the project, but also the specifics of how I work with you. And clarifying that, and those can be very simple conversations, but clarifying that can add, just take away some stress, I should say, from your team, because with them not knowing, they're trying to translate what it meant to be in the office to what it means to be at home. And their stress level on that may be higher than you recognize.
The ability to talk to people about these things and let them know that if you go so far into the budget and you haven't gotten this far with the project, it may be that we're not working on this in the right way. If you're not certain about the boundaries, if you're dealing with something new or ambiguous, don't worry about setting up the whole thing. Just turn around and say, let's take a little bit of time and a little bit of money and gather some information, and then come back again and look at what we're going to agree to next. Because that's what discovery is about. That's what exploring is about. And so having those conversations back and forth allows you to have your hands on the throttle as far as how far things go before you ascertain whether or not you're getting what you expected out of it. The other thing is, as you have these conversations with people, ask them to summarize what the agreement is. And if it's something that is a little bit more complex, or it does have some various aspects to it, ask them to summarize it in an email and send it to you. And that way it saves you the time of having to put it together. It also causes them to go back, whether they're sitting at home or going back to their desk at work, and they have to process what it is that you have just talked about, and they have to understand it well enough where they can put it into a written communication. And it's surprising how many times when you do that, people go back and maybe an hour or two or the next day they come back and say, hey, I just want to go through a couple things because I wasn't sure, because they've had to process it right away, versus they just go out and move on and may miss that point. So this is a great way for you then to, when you review things, just pull out that email that they sent, and you guys have a basis from which to have a conversation. And you can ask them to re-summarize again at your check-ins. It's just so much more comfortable being able to work off of something where the person's really working off something that they authored, they sent to you and agreed to.
I also want to say that it's okay to have informal check-ins. So there's built in, and what I mean by that is that used to be how we would have those conversations, getting coffee in the morning, or, bumping into someone at, or, intentionally stopping in at someone's office and just saying, how are you doing? there's ways to do that in this environment. You may want to ask people, Teams and different, there's a lot of software out there and those chat features and those, that we can just say, hey, how you doing? Or a text, so those things, it's okay to establish what those are in this space. I used to work with a guy who was the master at the walk around manager, right? I mean, he would get his coffee and he would be, his first hour of the day was like he had a route and he just kind of checked in with everyone. And it is hard in this environment to get that assurance that, people are there, people are working, people get the project. So it's okay for you to say, I want to do these. Can I do them via chat, or can I just, send you a text and just for that pulse that you want to get? Because one, that establishes the purpose. So it's not necessarily to change your priorities or to give you more work. It's just to say, hey, you good. And so it doesn't add another layer of stress to someone. It's truly supposed to be there to relieve that.
So what we're trying to do is we're trying to wrap this all around culture, because culture is just the way that we work and the way that we interact with each other. And what we're trying to suggest with all of this is that a culture of accountability is one where people know what is expected of each other, and that they are comfortable approaching each other and having difficult conversations, because they make those conversations about the issues. And they recognize that when things don't go the way that they expected, that is an opportunity to learn. And they take the time to be able to have that conversation and make the adjustment. And that now especially seems hard to do because we're under pressure. But that tone of doing that modeling that behavior starts with you. And if you're the senior executive, everybody's watching you. If you're not in that role and you start modeling these behaviors and explaining what accountability is, you can be influential in helping that move throughout the culture in your organization. So what we'd like you to do as part of this is we'd like you to find 5 minutes today where you sit down, and if somebody else from your organization's here, get together with them. If you're not, ideally find a dialogue partner, somebody else that you can talk to about this, and write down what are 3 to 5 things that you can take away from this that's going to help you be a better leader. And then share that list with your colleagues if you're here together, or with your dialogue partner, and ask them to hold you accountable for developing as a leader and doing these things.
And as you're thinking about that, we'd love to hear what that is, if you'd want to put that in the chat. What were the takeaways? This isn't rocket science, but we all need these refreshers. And, as Joe and I do these, it's just to give you a slightly different perspective of what these things mean and how to execute those through the day. But, I'd love to hear from you. And, if you guys have any, what resonated with you today, and if there's something that, you feel you can do as a better leader, we'd love to hear that too. It's not easy. And I would say as a leader in this environment, it is hard because you can't look people in the eyeball. And, even today, we're going to shut down our computer and we're all going to be sitting in our little corners of the world. So that human interaction is hard. And that's such a component of leadership. These are tough times. And as and Joe and I are here to help. We talked about a lot today, but if there are issues that you have or questions that you have that we just can't get to today, we'd love to have a conversation with you about that. and talk about how, maybe another perspective may help your situation. And we just ask that you reach out to us. And, we would be happy as part of today to set up those, inquiry conversations and really kind of maybe give you some tangible action items for your specific issues.
We've all been to presentations where we're listening to things and, it comes together and it seems to make sense. And then 4 hours later, after you've been living in your reality for half a day, you start to try to apply that and you go, well, why did it seem like it was so easy then and now it seems so difficult, or my situation's different? That's what that invitation is for. We'd be glad to kind of talk to you after you've had a chance to process, and when you're at a point where you might realize, wait a minute, this isn't working the way they talked about. And so please reach out and just connect.
Yeah, because it's never as easy. Executing is never as easy as is always more difficult than talking about it. And and we've been there. We have. I would say that the challenges of pushing big projects through, is something that Joe and I have helped other organizations with and have helped our own organizations with.
Yeah. So everything first. We'd be glad to have a complimentary conversation if that works for you. Our hope for you is that you got that 1 to 3 things that you can take away and work on and apply, and that's going to make a difference for you and for your organization, and that you're able to be a better leader, but also to be able to help others be better leaders as well. We really appreciate all of you that were here throughout the conversation today. And Vicki, did we have any other outstanding comments that we wanted to address?
No, I think we're good, unless the chat is still open. But again, if this forum is not comfortable to you, just send us an email. We'd be happy to reach out to you with those. But we truly do appreciate your time today and kind of reestablishing a couple definitions of words used so often: accountability and authority, right? So we appreciate your time this morning.
And I want to express our appreciation to John and Mark at the Chamber for organizing this and providing the means for us to get together and have a shared experience this morning. Thank you.
All right. Have a great day.